Welcome everyone to the seventh and final session in the Five Big Ideas in Inequality series. I am Karen Dinan. I'm a professor of the practice at the Kennedy School and in the Department of Economics here at Harvard. The series is an initiative of the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone PhD Scholars Program in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And over the last 7 weeks, the series has presented a variety of fresh, insightful ideas for how we think about the problems of inequality and how we can reduce inequality. We've heard from a terrific batch of speakers with ideas for tackling income inequality and wealth concentration, inequality in COVID-19, inequality in the justice system, the role of good jobs in reducing inequality, the racial wealth gap, environmental inequalities, and more. And it's already clear the series is going to generate further ideas and discussion, and that students will be inspired to pursue their own work in these areas. So we're just incredibly excited about it. Let me outline the plan for today. Each of our speakers will talk for about 8 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A. I encourage you to post your questions in the chat as we go along. In the discussion period, we'll do a combination of questions drawn from the chat and questions through the raise hand function. So that's the practicalities. Let me now briefly introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll speak. They'll also each say something about themselves at the start of their presentation. But first we'll have Charlotte Cavalier, who is a political scientist and assistant professor of public policy at the University of Michigan Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Charlotte is a PhD alumna of the Inequality and Social Program herself and is currently writing a book titled Asking for More: Support for Redistribution in the Age of Inequality. After Charlotte, we'll have Mesmin Destin, who is an associate professor of psychology and of human development and social policy at Northwestern University. Mesmin investigates social psychological mechanisms underlying socioeconomic disparities in educational outcomes during adolescence and young adulthood. We'll then feature Gordon Hanson, who is the Peter Wertheim Professor in Urban Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Gordon specializes in international trade, international migration, and economic geography. And then I will finish up with my talk, and you'll hear more about me at the beginning of that. So with that introduction, we're gonna jump right in. So Charlotte, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Karen. And yes, I am an alum, and as a result, it's really extra special to be here today. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Pam. So a few words about me. So I'm obsessed as an academic with the topic of understanding the political dynamics that underpin the maintenance and erosion of the welfare state. So I'm obsessed about the welfare state and what explains how you can maintain it or how support, especially for the welfare state, might erode over time. I'm 99% done with this book. The title is a little different. It's no longer Asking for More, it's Fair Enough, because I was told asking for more is clumsy. So I'm also happy I still get feedback on the book title. So let me jump in. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 7 minutes is a tongue-in-cheek idea with what I think are potentially big theoretical payoffs for research going forward. So I'll be curious to see if you agree with this. I won't tell you what the idea is right now. Let me give you some context first. So if you've read any usually left-leaning newspapers lately, like the New York Times, The Guardian, or even the FT, Martin Wolf is pretty big on this narrative. You've heard some version of the following that's on the slide here. So the claim that growing inequality is feeding into the rise of populism, all right? That there's a connection between inequality and the success of populist parties and candidates. So in trying to unpack the causal chain between the two, there's one particular group of voters that has attracted most of the attention from scholars like myself and others, namely what we call the economic losers, people towards the bottom of the income distribution. So think white working class, low skill workers, the rural, right voters, etc. I usually think of this group as members, as people who are both members of the majority group and of the lower ranking income groups. So why do we care so much about this group of voters? Well, we do because their behavior appears the most puzzling in light of theoretical expectations and basic intuition about what this category of voters should be doing. So what is this most basic intuition? Well, it's the idea that economic losers in times of rising inequality should want to tax the economic winners, either out of self-interest, envy, spite, whatever motive you want to attribute, but we expect them basically to go and vote for the Jeremy Corbyn, Mélenchon in the case of France, Sanders in the case of the US of the world. Well, in practice, we're seeing that these groups of voters are really going towards these guys, all right? So as a result, a lot of the research focuses on making sense of the misguided policy preferences and voting behaviors of economic losers. And so this whole genre of research is kind of started by Thomas Frank in the early 2000s with this "what's the matter with Texas" type of research. The research is basically trying to explain why don't they think of themselves as beneficiaries of left-wing redistributive policies, or why, irrespective of what their economic policy preferences are, why do they care so much about non-economic issues to the point of voting for the right-wing populist parties? So reviewing the research, I have come to the conclusion that the returns on investment for that line of inquiry is very low. We have done so much work, we have collected so much data, and I'm not sure we have made much progress since Adorno's attempt to make sense of mass support for Hitler. Some people might disagree, we can talk about it in the Q&A. So in addition, and this is what I will focus on for the rest of the talk, I think that if we're going to focus on misguided voters, the worst offenders are not the economic losers, they are the economic winners, or at least a subset of them. So my idea is that instead we should focus on making sense of the misguided policy preferences and voting behavior of economic winners. So let me show you a little bit of data to illustrate this point. I have way more data to back my claim. This is just an illustration. Again, happy to talk more in the Q&A. And because this is mostly an American audience, I think I'm going to kind of use American data. So what I'm going to do here is show you, using here the General Social Survey, people's economic preferences. So what I did is I took a bunch of items that were asked repeatedly over time. Because they correlate enough, I was able to create an index that I then use to try to understand what are the economic policy preferences of Republicans and Democrats broken down by income quintile. And there, the way the data I'm going to show you is plotted is that higher values mean that they're more left-wing, more conservative on these bundles of items that ask about federal spending, support for redistribution, and the like. So here I have plotted on the left the top quintile, Republicans were among the top income quintile, and on the right, Democrats were among the bottom income quintile. This specific data takes out, basically focuses on white people, but in the end, you get the same pattern actually if you put everybody in. So here we see exactly self-interest in action, right? We've got a bunch of high income people who are really conservative, low income people who are way more liberal. And what I've done is I've centered the x-axis on the mean and +1 or -1 standard deviation. So basically you can interpret this as close to 2 standard deviation difference in this economic preference scale. So that's kind of our ideal world of self-interest. So what's going on now with 2 other groups of voters, which is low income Republican and high income Democrats. So let me plot the bottom quintile Republicans. So here you see that relative to their peers in the Democratic Party, they are a little bit more conservative, okay? But still, there is an income gradient among the Republican Party. There are differences between the rich and the poor in the Republican Party. Now, how do the rich Democrats compare to the rich Republicans? Well, if we're going to think in terms of deviation of what self-interest tells us, they're deviating 3 times more than the low-income Republicans, all right? So the low-income Republicans are a little bit more conservative than the low-income Democrats, But if anything, the high income Democrats are so liberal that there's no income gradient in terms of attitudes on these economic preferences scale. There's no income differences here. Today, income says nothing among Democrats of what your preferences on this scale are. So why is this important? Well, again, if we're going to focus on misguided behavior, misguided preferences to try to guide our research, then we might actually be barking up the wrong tree. Instead of asking what is the matter with Kansas, we should be asking, like Gelman said, what is the matter with Connecticut? All right? So this is one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons lately, at least. I don't know if I'll get it for the book, but you know, these beggars are asking, and the haves, you might say, are divided into the gives and give-nots. So what are the implications of shifting our emphasis from the have-nots to the haves who give? And so here I'm looking at the flashing screen, and it hasn't flashed yet, so I actually have time to go very briefly on what are the implications. The implications are twofold. I've broken them down in terms of positive, think positivist social science, positive implications for research, and normative implications. So the positive implications, well, it's great for theory testing. All the theories we developed to explain the behavior of the have-nots, the misguided have-nots, we should be also testing them on the haves who give. We should be able to test our theories. Our theories should explain both types of voters, and a lot of our tests that are currently obsessing on explaining deviation at the bottom should be as good at explaining deviation from the top. And a lot of them are not, actually. So there's a lot of work that can be done by focusing on the top that can help with theory testing and theory development. My own work, I find it very helpful, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A. I basically come to very different conclusions from what Piketty argues in his last book, if you've read it, but we can talk about this later. The second implication is normative, which is, as researchers, we need a counterfactual. We need a baseline model that might not hold true, but from which we can question the world. And that's where this assumption that people should be self-interested comes from. Well, if this is the model that we apply, then we should be applying this model equally to all different income groups. All groups should be open to the same type of scrutiny. It could help us rethink what we think this baseline model is, what is the kind of correct behavior. But also, I think normatively, there's a tendency to just, generate so much scrutiny on one group. From a normative perspective, as researchers, I think all groups should be open to the same type of scrutiny, I think is the word. So I will stop here. I think I've got a red slide, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlotte. We're going now to Mesman.
So I'm glad to be following Charlotte. I'm going to be focusing in on the context of higher education, which many of us are quite familiar with. But thinking about these ideas of how drawing attention to the actions of people and institutions with the power and the sort of economic resources may be a useful approach to understanding the outcomes of those who are marginalized within those contexts. So I'm a social psychologist and I study education primarily. I do a lot of work to understand what are the experiences that young people from lower income backgrounds or historically marginalized, underrepresented minority groups backgrounds within education from K through 12 into higher education. And what are the different programs, run experiments to determine what different types of programs, experiences, interactions have positive effects on students' outcomes. So today I'll talk about some of the work that we're doing, focused particularly on trying to shift some perspectives in higher education to more effectively serve students from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, particularly lower SES backgrounds. And this is work in collaboration with colleagues at Northwestern, Josiah Rosario and Shirin Basuji. And here's the citation for a recent paper that covers a lot of the ideas that I'll talk about. So overall, the broad issue I want to draw focus to is this notion of socioeconomic disparities in the experience of college for those who reach college, and also success in actually reaching high achievement levels and graduating from college. Where in addition to seeing this consistent patterns where students from lower SES backgrounds tend to find poorer outcomes within certain educational institutions, they also, even among those who do well and are able to graduate and show high achievement levels, their experience is quite different than those from higher SES backgrounds in a number of ways. They can have some unintended costs. The dominant approach to dealing with this persistent issue often has some underlying assumptions that have a deficit-based emphasis on assimilation. And the idea being that if we can shift the ways that students from these marginalized backgrounds orient themselves or act within the educational institution, we can lead towards improving their outcomes and experiences. And what I'd suggest is that we'll be more successful if we take a more expansive approach to thinking about how to develop learning environments that improve achievement and well-being for all students. And what I mean is that there are aspects of students' backgrounds, particularly from lower SES backgrounds, that we think about that students need to overcome, rather than institutions finding ways to actually embrace the unique strengths that these backgrounds may be bringing to educational institutions and shifting and expanding what it means to attend college and what you learn there. This is just a figure I wanted to show that highlights some of the consequences of the status quo of young people who are experiencing socioeconomic mobility. As you move from the left to the right on this figure, you're essentially going through college, experiencing socioeconomic mobility, and encountering a large range of different types of what we call identity challenges, where you feel a less of a sense of belonging within the academic context that's higher in income generally, feeling disconnected from your past experiences and past relationships, and often feeling uncertain about what this means for where you may land afterwards. And all of these patterns, these psychological experiences, are strongly associated with negative achievement-related outcomes as well, even for highly capable students. What's also important about this figure is that there's more than just the achievement and psychological perspectives, but also the physiological and physical health consequence of this experience. That actually achieving socioeconomic mobility and working through these conditions has some negative effects on important physiological processes like inflammation, with long-term negative consequences for disease development that we're finding socioeconomic mobility is associated with. So I wanted to give a little bit more detail on a specific experiment, a proof of concept experiment that builds on this idea of how to think about students' backgrounds in a different way and what those consequences might be. And then I'll expand on what the consequences are and the implications are for policy at multiple levels. This is work led by a doctoral student in my lab, Ivan Hernandez. And the idea here is to build from a perspective called community cultural wealth that I described briefly, where the backgrounds of students from marginalized groups are full of many different ranges of resources that are often unrecognized within many institutions. And recognizing those resources may improve the institutions themselves. And what we wanted to do was to directly test whether giving the chance to be exposed to that orientation of a background specific strength from a lower SES background has a positive effect directly on students' well-being and persistence within the context. So in the experiment, we recruited a couple hundred college students from across the country and randomly assigned them, half of them to sort of business as usual and half of them to go through this experiment where they learned about this orientation, that their backgrounds are likely to have these unique strengths that may be unrecognized as a result of marginalization, and to write and reflect about what that might mean to them. So what one student wrote, for example, is, I have these background specific strengths from growing up in a lower tier, of being hardworking and diligent with my time. It's beneficial to me getting good grades and fulfilling my educational goals. So the idea that this background, which is often seen as something to overcome and get past, is something to embrace and really build from, and part of succeeding within the college context and beyond. So we wanted to look at a couple of direct consequences of this shift in orientation or messaging that students often encounter. And so I compared some immediate psychological outcomes after students did this activity compared to a couple of comparison groups. And first off, what we see is that students do indeed have an increase in their endorsement of this idea that I have certain strengths that can benefit my school and society. The background specific strengths condition had a boost compared to students who didn't write anything or students who wrote about a regular day. So this is a message that students can take up. Also, it's a message that has a direct effect on students' well-being. And this is a standard measure of self-esteem. I feel satisfied or good about myself. I trust in my abilities to succeed. A significant boost here as well compared to students randomly assigned to other conditions. And finally, another outcome I'll show is related to their sort of sense of academic persistence. The idea being that, do you feel that it's meaningful and worthwhile to continue to work on difficult tasks? So this is a measure on how you interpret difficulty. Lower scores means you're less likely to interpret difficulty on an academic task as a sign that something's impossible. And we find that in this background-specific strengths condition, students were less likely to think that difficulty means that what I'm working on is impossible than in the control conditions. And so building from this sort of initial proof of concept study, we've done a number of follow-up studies that show similar patterns in different types of ways. For example, when we have these messages coming from faculty members, we randomly assign students to encounter a message from faculty, whether it's on a syllabus or through a first lecture that they might interact with. We find that the students who get this message about background-specific strengths, again, students from lower SES backgrounds in particular, have an increase in their sense that they can be their authentic self in the classroom, increase in their sense of efficacy, that they can do well in that classroom, increases in several measures of motivation, and increases in actual persistence on a difficult academic task. So these messages have consequences for how students from these lower SES groups are able to succeed and engage when they're getting these messages about their background that counter the normative message that they're likely to run into. So I'm going to talk about what the consequences are of this perspective with some related evidence of other effects at multiple levels of context. The proof of concept study that I described focuses on this individual level, what are students' actual beliefs and how does it affect their outcomes? But of course, students are embedded within several levels, many levels of context, and are getting messages within the higher education that may affirm or counteract their beliefs, their positive beliefs about themselves and about their marginalized groups. So for example, at the peer environment level, we found that random assignment to a program where you get messages from your peers that difference is actually a strength versus something to avoid reduces or eliminates socioeconomic achievement gaps within an educational context. And at a policy level, I think this reinforces some of the initiatives that we've seen and work towards for strengths-based community scholars programs at institutions that help to reinforce these types of messages from peers, and opportunities to build connections and establish and maintain connections with family and important community resources throughout. At the faculty level, I mentioned already a study that we've been, some studies we've been doing showing these messages about background strengths having positive implications for students coming from faculty. And there's other related work also showing how the different types of practices faculty engage in that give messages to students about what it means to come from a lower income background or their capacity to succeed or to improve have these direct implications for student achievement over time as well. So this suggests a range of different possible faculty development opportunities and learning communities that could be mechanisms to improve student outcomes and reduce this form of inequality. At the broader institutional climate level, we've done experiments to show directly how the types of policies that institutions have that give financial and economic resources for lower income students and show a commitment to lower income students have a direct and immediate impact on their sense that they can succeed in their motivation within that context as well. So this supports a wide range of policies to improve and increase the types of financial resources for access and for equitable participation for students, regardless of their economic background. And finally, I just want to mention some ongoing work about the broader socio-political context. I think a lot of our fellow colleagues do a lot of work to think about, and the types of messages that students are receiving about their racial ethnic group in particular, whether it's an anti-immigrant sentiment or their Black Lives Matter movements, or the different types of movements that directly engage with students' identities. Those messages have implications for, we find, student sense of belonging within academic context. So the ways that institutions orient themselves in relation to those movements have really strong implications as well to consider in thinking about this shift on how to elevate how we work towards the work that we do in higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Mesbin. We are moving on now to Gordon Hanson.
Thanks very much, Karen. It's really a delight to be part of this panel, and I've really enjoyed this series, which has put just a set of deeply important issues on the table, and now with an incoming administration in the United States that might be more amenable to taking up these ideas. Now is just an excellent time to be thinking about these challenges. I study the economics of place. I'm an international economist, but I'm interested in regions and cities. And so I like to think of regions and cities as like little macroeconomies that exist in the global economy, colliding with each other in interesting and challenging ways. In the last 10 years or so, that orientation has led me to focus on the consequences of globalization for labor market outcomes in local economies in the United States as well as in other countries. And a lot of that work has been about the impact of the China trade shock on local labor market conditions. That work led me to appreciate that one of the fundamental challenges that a number of countries face. This club used to include primarily higher income countries like the US, the UK, France, and Germany, but now increasingly includes emerging economies, Mexico, China, Brazil, and so forth. And that challenge is a regional economic divide, separation of an economy into groups of regions, one of which is vibrant, connected to the global economy, expanding economic opportunity, employment growth, wage growth, attracting young workers to come and take advantage of exciting new occupations as they emerge. And another group of regions which have been left behind. And in that left behind group is very much behind some of the insights that Charlotte shared with us. And so I want to take some of her ideas about kind of the politics of this and now think about what might it mean for social policy. And to do that, I want to put a really simple idea on the table. And that's, how do we help regions from becoming yet a new entrant into the club of the left behind? To do so, I want to share with you the experience of one place, and a place that kind of by any definition matches this, the features of places that have really lost out in terms of what's going on in the global economy. That place is Martinsville, Virginia. I'm showing you one slide, not a slide, it's a screen from a data visualization platform that David Deming and I are building at the Wiener Center for Social Policy at the Kennedy School, in which we're using data visualization to communicate insight from our research and other people's research to a broader audience, and to try and get beyond regression tables and standard errors into formats that connect with people in a deeper way. So the region I want to talk to you about is Martinsville, Virginia. Go back to 1990, Martinsville, Virginia was just a thriving manufacturing center. It had 45% of working age adults employed in manufacturing, and they were in two industries, furniture and textiles. Over the next 25 years, what happened is the bottom fell out of the market for firms competing in those two sectors. And the consequence in Martinsville was factory closure, was massive job loss in manufacturing, such that by 2016, you had only 13% of working age adults now employed in manufacturing. So it just moved a whole generation of folks out of work who were then looking for a new source of livelihood. So where do they turn? Possibilities might include getting a job elsewhere in manufacturing, not possible in Martinsville because the two industries that were there have been hit severely hard. Another possibility is to move elsewhere. Something else that doesn't happen because non-college educated workers, who are the majority of those who lost their jobs, aren't that mobile geographically, and have become even less mobile over time. Third possibility is to move into non-manufactured activity. And that you might expect to be the default, but what we see is that that didn't happen, and instead, what happened was a move into joblessness, such that the fraction of adults of working age who were employed fell from 73% in 1990 to 53% in 2016. So now what we have is that joblessness building on itself. As industries decline, the de-agglomeration effects magnify themselves because it's agglomeration economies in reverse. When you push a lot of workers out of work, it has the impact of creating a local recession, and that that magnifies itself throughout the local economy. And when you move a group that is disproportionately male out of work, you create challenges for the social fabric of a community, in that the response that we see in lots of different places is an increase in social dislocation, drug and alcohol abuse, increase in other risky behaviors, family breakdown, and increasing incidence of children living in poverty. So what do we do about this? What I propose, my simple idea, is that we create a rapid response force that is keyed on addressing joblessness when it happens. So the problem with Martinsville is that we're coming to our senses about what happened in communities like these 20 years after the shock, in fact, hits. What we want to be doing is getting workers back to work as quickly as possible in these places when you have the sort of challenges that lead to mass layoffs and mass factory closure. So how we do that is, here the research is pretty useful. We know the characteristics of job loss that are most devastating for communities. It's when they happen in a tradable industry. So a locality is losing its key export sector. It's when it involves massive plant closure, because that means the job loss is permanent. And when it hits the non-college educated most acutely, because that's the group that's least geographically mobile. So what I propose is that we devote, in part of our measurement of local economic conditions, measures of at high frequency of local economic distress, which keys on the magnitude of recent job loss and the extent to which that job loss is driven by tradable industries and by non-college educated workers. And when you reach high enough thresholds, what then kicks into effect are a set of policies that are focused on getting workers back to work. And that's going to include a suite of interventions whose mix will certainly vary by context, but would include funds for retraining, would include things like wage subsidies to encourage the hiring of workers by firms that might want to move in and take advantage of those opportunities. And it also includes incentives for drawing workers in who might be anchors for job growth, in particular the higher skilled, which we could do through the targeted allocation of high skilled immigration visas. So that's my idea. It's not going to solve the entire problem of regional economic distress. It's picking off one particular feature of this. How do we help regions that have been hit hard by economic shocks not become one of these places that's left behind? Some great discussion in some of the earlier panels by Chuck Sable and Tim Bartik in particular about what do we do about places that are living with this legacy. And so those policies would be complementary to what I'm discussing here. And with that, Karen, I will turn things back to you.
Thank you. So that just leaves me. I am Karen Dinan. I'm a professor of the practice of economic policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Economics Department. And I've been here since 2017, but I spent most of my career in public policy jobs in Washington, DC, most recently for 3 years as Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the US Treasury Department. My big idea for reducing inequality, which builds off much of what I did during my years in Washington, is to use macroeconomic policy to run a hot economy. So I'm going to make my argument with 4 points. I'm first going to talk about how recessions are costly, with the burden falling disproportionately on already struggling populations. Then I'm going to talk about how effective countercyclical macroeconomic policy can make a big difference. From there, I'm going to go to the thing that we want to do right now, which is to go big with additional fiscal stimulus. And the 4th point will be the priority for later, which is to keep policy supportive until the recovery is complete for everyone. So let me go with my first point. We know that recessions are terrible because they impose concentrated costs. And this slide is showing you a couple of examples of how the costs tend to fall disproportionately on already struggling populations. So the panel on the left shows unemployment rates for the least educated group and the most educated group. And the panel on the right shows unemployment rates for Blacks versus whites. So first of all, there are concerning gaps in normal times, but the point I want to make is that the gaps become much larger, as much as twice as big during recessions, with, for example, unemployment rates for low income and Blacks topping out at 15% during the Great Recession. That's more than 1 in 7 workers. In the current recession, we have seen the most small business struggles among those small businesses that are minority owned and immigrant owned. These results from Robert Fairley show that even after things started to bounce back in June, that's the right group of bars, the share of Black owned and immigrant owned businesses, small businesses still closed, was 3 to 4 times higher than the share for white owned businesses. And there's a literature in economics that documents all sorts of other human costs of recessions. So for example, Davis and von Wachter followed men laid off during a bad recession over 20 years and found that they lost close to 3 years of their pre-displacement earnings. That's just a huge loss. There are papers that look at children and show that parental layoffs not only impair children's current academic performance and their current mental health. There's a paper that shows that a parental layoff takes a measurable toll on children's income as adults. You might know that recessions overall seem to reduce mortality for a variety of reasons. For example, there are fewer car accidents because people are spending less time commuting. Even so, it's clear that unemployment, job loss, is bad for physical and mental health of the person who loses the job. And new entrants to the labor market, particularly those with low skills, see earnings scarred for years afterwards. So going on to my second point, effective countercyclical macroeconomic policy can make a big difference. We saw that during the Great Recession. Here's a few examples. Europe, which pursued less vigorous countercyclical policy, had a much weaker recovery. Academic studies like this one by my colleague Gabriel Chodorow-Reich in the economics department clearly document that fiscal policy is effective in fighting recessions. And we can just look at polls of economists from the left and from the right that indicate a consensus that countercyclical fiscal policy works. The experience of the current recession also provides powerful evidence along these lines. So we've had staggering job loss. Jobs were down by 22 million at the worst point. Lower income workers have again been the hardest hit, but there was a significant early fiscal and monetary policy response that included expanded and more generous unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, supports for small businesses, monies for states and for the healthcare system, and some other things. And really my big point here is that household finances have held up remarkably well considering the degree of job loss. To show you what I mean, the graph on the left from our colleagues at tracktherecovery.org shows you that consumption has held up for lower income households. That's the green line. In fact, their consumption performs better than the consumption of higher income households. That's probably mostly, if not entirely, because higher income households do more discretionary spending on services that they have been able to cut back on because of the pandemic. On the right, I'm showing you that poverty actually fell for a time, which is just astonishing in an economy with double-digit employment. Fiscal stimulus also allowed job losers to actually save money for a time. This graph shows you median checking account balances for those who were laid off in blue and those who had jobs. So this brings me to my third point, which is that this is not the time to relax about this issue. It's time to go big with additional stimulus. If you follow the data closely like I do, you know we should be concerned about what lies ahead. Payrolls, which I show on the left, did show a big bounce early on in the recovery, and that's terrific that millions of jobs were created or recreated. But the US economy remains down by almost 10 million jobs relative to where it was before the pandemic. And what you're seeing on the right is that the rate of job growth has slowed from 5 million in June to just 250,000 in November. We got those data last Friday. You can do the math about how much further we'll be able to chip away at the problem in coming months, given that slow rate of job creation. So what's the prescription? First of all, support household incomes, sustain business operations, and reduce state and local government budget gaps with additional fiscal stimulus. I should say the needed amount of fiscal stimulus is uncertain, but we should remember that the risks are asymmetric. Doing too little would be much more costly because of those harms I discussed earlier than doing too much. And on the latter, I should say that people worry about erring on the high side and causing inflation, but the Fed can raise rates if that happens. So I think that we should be talking about at least $1 to $2 trillion in additional stimulus right now. And this is bigger than some of the calculations that are trying to calibrate very precisely just how big the hole is. Because the point is that support doesn't necessarily fall into the cracks you want it to hit. So the goal is to reach everyone in need, to reduce suffering now, but also to power a stronger recovery and prevent destructive longer-term scarring. So this brings me to my last point, which is, what about down the road? Well, here I say it's important to keep policy supportive until the recovery is complete for everyone. So there are just huge distributional benefits. There were huge distributional benefits to keeping monetary policy easy through the end of the 2010s. The panels on the left, those are just the differences between the unemployment rates I showed you in the first slide. And I just think it's just amazing how much the gaps closed towards the end of the decade. Okay, those gaps by 2019 were something like half as big as they were in the early 2000s when we had this kind of enormous booming economy. My panel on the right is showing you the variation in unemployment rates across states from a paper I did with Doug Elmendorf. You can see how impressively narrow that shaded area gets later in the decade. And having heard Gordon's talk, I'm now curious to go off and do this sort of calculation at the geographic level that would pick up the regions that he is working on. And finally, the hot economy produced gains in wealth for groups that traditionally have low wealth. And you can see that here in this slide, which shows data on the change in wealth over a 3-year period for different groups that we worry about. So this brings me to my last slide, which is my longer term prescription. Okay, so here I think we need the Federal Reserve continue to emphasize job creation so that we get that kind of long boom towards the end. I also think we need to put policies in place that will help us for next time. We should create employment-based triggers for federal tax cuts and spending increases so that strong counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy is more automatic and we don't end up in the kind of mess that we have with congressional gridlock right now. And more generally, we should fill holes in the safety net so that more people are protected from recession-related and just idiosyncratic job loss. So that's my big idea, and I look forward to our discussion.
Question: could each of you please state what's the main factor in your problematic? Not just the big idea, but the main and the heaviest factor in your problematic. What, I don't want to say the main independent variable, but what you're really focusing on, what you think is the main problem that you're bringing a solution to.
Does anyone want to go first? Charlotte, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so my specific big idea is for research going forward, when you try to understand the world, it's a complicated mess. And so you need to come to it with a set of priors. And usually the way we do research is we have strong priors and we look at deviation from that prior and we see how we can kind of fix our priors to try to close that gap between what we observe and what we theorize coming to our data. A lot of the work in my field has been looking at the deviation from a specific subset of voters. My big idea is we should actually spend as much, if not more, on the group of voters that's really deviating. And so in that sense, it has some kind of theoretical output that I'm happy to discuss more. Some of the questions have brought it up in the Q&A, and I'll jump to that in a second once we bring it up. But yeah, so my answer, my idea is about research. How do you do research? How do you pick a topic? How do you formulate a question?
All right, thanks.
Mesman, it's a good broad question. Do you want to give your answer?
Sure. Yeah. I think for me, the simple answer is that the factor that we isolate and try to understand the experiences and the sort of disparate outcomes are the ideologies and the assumptions that people in institutions have about lower income communities and lower income students, and the sort of deficit-based ideas that there are inherent shortcomings and a lack of substance to contribute as a function of your community. And all of the policies that stem from that ideology aren't able to harness some of the inherent strengths that students do have and to foster sort of true, deep motivation, positive outcomes. So it's this sort of ideology that's embedded within people and institutions that can be hard to identify, but can be structurally counteracted through specific practices and policies.
Thank you.
Terrific. And Gordon?
So I think my problem is tied to Karen's problem, that we're focusing on different dimensions. If you think of some of the things that Karen's talking about, is that when we have insufficient aggregate demand at the national level, caused by whatever shock, the impacts of that fall disproportionately on disadvantaged groups. I'm now looking at a local level, when you get massive job loss, which might not be affecting the country as a whole, might be regionally concentrated, that job loss can become endemic because there are frictions in labor markets which prevent workers from moving successfully into new lines of work. So that the problem I want to solve is how to prevent short-run joblessness from becoming permanent joblessness.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks. And I'll just comment and build off of what Gordon said. I mean, I think, where I'm coming from is that inequality tends to be kind of studied mostly by microeconomists because these structural trends over kind of the decades have been so important, and they have come from microeconomic forces. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are also huge inequalities and disparities that arise just because of kind of cyclical fluctuations in the economy. And we shouldn't forget that we have some really important tools to be able to mitigate those cyclical dynamics. And I think, too often we just think about, well, that's, how we're going to manage top line GDP growth, but we have to remember that recessions have enormous human costs. So our levers to mitigate them or to avoid them in the first place are just super important to get right if you care about income inequality. I am going to go back. Remember, you can raise your hand. I'm going to go back to the chat box. A couple of questions that came in for Charlotte. I'm gonna group two of them together. So first of all, can you please tell us about the deviations in your findings from Piketty's Brahmin left story in Capital in Ideology? And while you're at it, could you also outline your views on the sources of the differing views of self-interest on the part of winners on the left versus the right? That was something I was really curious about as well as you were talking, Charlotte.
Okay, great. So yeah, so Piketty is great. I always joke I wrote the public opinion book for Piketty's last book, even though he has ideology in the title. But so to some extent, political scientists, when they try to explain the behavior of this group, they're not, I don't think that they're doing a great job. In American politics, it's like, well, the Democrats, it's the partisan queue, and they just pick up on the narrative from parties. They're more exposed, they're more educated. They just pick up the bundle of policies, and they end up being a little too liberal relative to those who are associated with the Republicans. Piketty, the political scientists in Europe say, no, they're driven by the second dimension of politics, which is these non-economic values, cosmopolitan values, authoritarian versus liberal values. And then Piketty comes in and say, no, it's all about self-interest. Basically, these highly educated people are just a little more left-wing on economic issues because they want to fund these valuable public goods that they benefit from, which is higher education. And so what I found in my research is that it's more a mix of both in the sense that these cosmopolitan liberal attitudes are actually a very good predictor of whether or not you trust that people are not free riding on the collective risk pooling, the collective resources. So in the American context, it's racialized. Do you think or not African-American or free riders? In the European context, it is not racialized. There's something about immigrants, but not only. The free riders in the UK are actually white folks, white working class scroungers. But there's these differences across basically high-income people who go to the left and high-income people who go to the right, who are really about perceptions of how much you can trust that others are not free riding. So it's not just about more high education or more of these goods that are targeted to the highly educated. And so as a result, these class of voters end up being key in redistributive coalitions because they're genuine in their support for more redistribution. The thing is, it's a little bit of an expressive motive, because they rarely have to pay the consequences of their preferences, which is more tax to fund these types of redistributive policies. So in a case where it's in France, they had to pay more taxes, you can see that their willingness to pay more taxes to fund these goods does go down, even though they think it's going to deserving people. So basically, I think Piketty is missing a little bit on the kind of altruistic deservingness preferences part.
Thank you, Charlotte. I should have mentioned that I'm actually from Connecticut, and I have a long list of things that are the matter with Connecticut, so we could take that up offline. But anyway, Mesmin, a couple of questions came in about your research that I think just to illustrate the great appetite that people have to hear more about your results. So I'm going to also put together two questions. So one of the questions was this a one-time intervention, just a dose? And did you track these outcomes to see if they waned over time, or was it just a one-time survey? So that was one of the questions. And the other question was, is there any evidence of gender differences in the impact of the interventions, which seems like a super interesting angle?
Yeah, thanks. Those are both really important questions. The question about effects over time is, I think about it in a slightly different way than some folks. So the particular experiment that I shared and kind of zoomed in on, I think about as an experiment to try to understand a mechanism. To understand when you have a certain cue that's brought to mind in a moment, or a certain message that's salient within that moment, what is the direct causal effect on students within that moment or for a short period of time. We do sometimes see some long-term effects if we time these types of experiments in ways that are leveraged with resources or right when they engage with a certain context. But that particular experiment, we wanted to understand the mechanism and then use that to draw implications for what should happen in a more consistent way across all those different levels of context that I went into in more depth. So some of those experiments that do target the context, like the peer level context experiment or some of the faculty level pieces where they're going to have a more sustained interaction potentially. We have seen some long-term effects over a year or more, or sometimes the entire college journey on achievement. And I think that's really exciting and promising, but I wouldn't want the implication people will have to walk away from to be, well, this is the quote unquote intervention, or this is the treatment that should be transported from place to place. But rather it's this particular mechanism is something to try to activate in a way that's relevant to whatever context you're working in a consistent way, and to draw from that evidence and to put it into practice or into policy in a way that's relevant in a different form. And the second piece on gender, the studies that I focused on were the mechanisms, again, were primarily about thinking about your economic background, thinking about the economic resources in your environment or your socioeconomic upbringing. And we didn't find any variation across gender in those effects. We found them to affect lower income young men and women similarly. So that tends to be the case when the treatment targets one sort of aspect of demographic variation, that it affects students across those. But I will say in prior work with younger students, in similar types of studies more about access and resources for higher education that have positive effects, that those were more effective for girls. And the reason for that, we found, was that there was a certain level of achievement, a baseline level of achievement where the motivation was effective. So for students who are already disengaged to a certain degree, which were more often boys in a particular study, they were less likely to be positively affected. But if you have students who are all above a certain threshold of engagement or already in college, we found equivalent effects across gender.
Thanks, Mesvin. I am going to put a couple of questions towards Gordon in a minute. But I will, before I do that, I just want to encourage everyone who's here. I know I'm not getting to everyone's questions in the chat, but I want to encourage you, particularly if I've skipped over your question, please raise your hand so that we can see other people talking besides just me and the other panelists. But while we're waiting for people to do that, Gordon, I'm going to give you, first of all, just my own question. I'm going to take that prerogative as moderator, and I'll ask you another one from chat as well. But my own question is just, I was super interested in this idea that you're going to develop metrics to kind of sound the alarm if we think a community has challenges along these lines that need to be addressed. That seems just terrific. I was wondering, to the extent that you have those metrics already developed, whether you have been watching what's going on around the United States over the last few years. Mostly we had a hot economy, as I said, but we also had some things going on like tariffs put in place that hurt certain industries. And I was just wondering whether there were any red flags you were seeing. The other question I'm going to ask you is one that comes from chat. Is there a way to find out how the long-term unemployed use their time, not informal work? Do they spend their time with their kids? So can there be a positive trade-off if kids are getting more attention? I highlighted some research that suggested the effects are net negative. I was wondering if you knew, but it's about kind of unemployed people, not long-term unemployed. So I was wondering if you had seen any research that goes along with that hypothesis.
Yeah, thanks very much, Karen. I've just taken those questions in order. We're looking closely at the impact of the Trump tariffs on employment in the U.S., both on the industries that were supposed to be helped and on the industries that were hurt because you're raising the cost of imported inputs that then make firms less profitable and employment often suffers. What we're finding in general is pretty small effects. At least so far, but that work is very much in progress. We're more confident about the small impacts of the Trump tariffs on the industries that were supposed to be helped. Those look like they're almost non-existent. Understanding the industries that are hurt, those impacts look modest, but that again is still lots of work yet to be done. The other sector that I would say really raises flags is one that is also hit by technological change, but we don't often recognize it as such, and that's what's going on in coal, oil, and gas. You've got a bunch of regions in which non-college educated workers are really concentrated in producing energy using based on the carbon economy. We're moving out of the carbon economy for a bunch of different reasons, and job loss associated with that transition is serious. And given the politics of it, those workers often get overlooked. On the second question regarding kind of implications for time use and family, David Autor, and I have a recent paper in American Economic Review Insights in which we look at outcomes for children, and it does look quite clearly like a net negative. This issue of time use is something that's harder for us to look at given sample sizes when you get to some of these communities. So that's a really interesting idea, happy to pursue. Related to that, this issue of childcare, you think about the difficulty in moving. Childcare is such a major feature there because in particular for the non-college educated, if you move, you leave a family support network that often provides childcare. And so when you think about the nature of interventions we need in order to make successful transitions possible, that needs to be, on the front line.
Thanks, Gordon. And before I go to Jenny's question, I just want to answer a couple of questions that came up for me in chat. They're both, I see them as related. Someone asked, how can the Dems motivate GOP members of Congress to enact legislation to extend aid beyond the end of 2020? And someone else asked, any thoughts of a stimulus that targets minority and immigrant community, small business owners, and would that policy ever pass? I see them as related because I think that the stimulus that we did early on basically has been a victim of its own success in some ways, because things have just, the blow to the economy from all this job loss just hasn't been nearly as big as what we saw in 2008 to 2009 and 2010. And I think people are missing the fact, they're missing the lesson here, which is that's precisely because we did this counter-cyclical policy. And instead, I think they're putting too much weight on the normal healing powers of the economy, which is what's, which is I think not the major factor. And so I think trying to create the political will for more has to center around trying to persuade people that no, we are really headed from some hard times until we get until we get the vaccine put in place, which is going to be at least half a year, if not longer. And we could end up with very persistent effects if we wipe out a bunch of small businesses, including and especially small minority and immigrant small businesses, because those people have generally so little financial buffer to kind of revive themselves. So I think it just has to be a matter of arguing that kind of we're heading for short-term damage to the economy, but also heading for some pretty long-term consequences that are serious. Anyway, from there, Jenny Mansbridge, thank you very much for answering my plea for people to raise their hands. Jenny, you should ask your question, and other people, please, again, I encourage you to raise your hands.
Mine is a very short question. I thought every one of these talks was terrific, but I wanted to ask Gordon, could you be a little bit more specific about your rapid response force? What exactly would you do when a town has a couple of its major manufacturers leave?
And is Charlotte, did you want to come in with something too? Okay, so
Yeah,
Gordon,
because I'm from a country where we have these policies, France.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi. And I see these task force come in and the welfare state kick in and we move people around, and I'm not sure it helped that much. So I'm kind of curious if you're going to do comparative stuff on that.
Yeah. So the example that labor economists like to cite is Denmark. And odd as it might seem, if you look at labor market flexibility and the looseness of labor laws, Denmark looks a lot like the UK and the US. Denmark is subject to the same shocks. It got hit by the China shock. It's gotten hit by technological change. It's seen downsizing of its manufacturing labor force, but it's been much more successful at helping workers redeploy into other sectors. So that the concept there is one of flex security, in which you're providing workers with what is effectively wage insurance, so that you're going to make sure that you're taking care of people's livelihood, but you aren't tying access to that support to staying out of work. And a lot of what we do in the United States is to condition income support on not being employed. So that would be item one on the list. Second on the list is recognizing that there is a public good quality to maintaining employment in these localities, which would justify subsidies to the hiring of workers who would actually come in, and not trying to be as hands-off as possible, but to create incentives for firms to come in and take advantage of what should be an available set of workers, rather than thinking of it as a distressed economy. And then the other thing is that I think we're missing many of our policy interventions don't leverage information that exists in communities, that are embedded in civic institutions, that are created by the social capital of a place, and that help you think about making intervention context specific. I don't exactly know how you do that. But if you look at some of the places, in particular, some of the manufacturing places that pivoted well, civic leaders and civic organizations played a very important role in that process.
thanks, Gordon. Marie Pascal.
Hi, yes. My question is actually more for Charlotte Carrier. So, Charlotte, you had started your talk thinking a little bit about generally about voters who are voting for sort of extreme wing parties. And yet when you were showing sort of these gaps over time, right, over the last few decades, it didn't seem like there was something that had changed over time, right? And so I was sort of left a little bit wanting, thinking, oh, well, you know, it's an interesting idea to want to focus on the higher end, right? But what then explained this change, right? And maybe that's not the point of your research, but I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? And so there's two things from this graph. First of all, I didn't put the standard errors just to kind of for clarity, but the group sizes are changing. So starting the early 2000s, income doesn't predict which party you go towards, but it did before. So the groups were of different sizes. There's been some movement. Second, yes, things are pretty stable. It's like, it's a famous finding in political science. We call it parallel publics, that actually, you sometimes have an income gradient and then it moves in parallel, but things are pretty stable. So what I found in my research, things are pretty stable because a lot of the thing we do to public opinion data is getting more to some kind of core set of values. I study fairness beliefs, meaning beliefs about the extent to which the status quo abides by norms of fairness, right? And these are pretty stable over time because they're basically sustaining the institutional setup in each of these countries. So for flex security, for instance, the beliefs that you need is you both need to believe that markets are fair institutions, but you also need to believe that when the government comes in with these policies, they're not going to be a lot of moral hazard, free riding, et cetera. So that's a combination of beliefs that don't exist in the US. So that's aside. Now, in explaining what's happening with the kind of electoral success of these types of candidates, I have two responses. One is we should be way more humble than we are currently we talk about that stuff, because if anything, I'm not sure we know exactly what's going on. And so a lot of my work is more, all right, let's try to unpack what we know and don't know, and maybe change the angle of attack, because the traditional one is just, in my opinion, not really working. Then political science has found some good evidence of what explains at least the overtime variation. And a lot of this, at least the most interesting factors, first of all, economic downturns do matter for the electoral success of these parties. And then the other one is what's happening in the rest of the party system. What are the strategies of other political parties? In the US case, the way I like to think about it is that it's a system that's very closed. So whatever demand for that type of right-wing candidate, there was no way to observe it or measure it. Trump, you know, like you put the pot is simmering, it kind of closed, you get Trump. And then once you take over that kind of two-party system, you can get on board these other more traditional Republicans who just don't want to vote for the Democrats. So you get this weird pattern of nothing, and then it kind of bursts and it kind of reshapes the party system. In multiple party system, it works differently. That's where the institutional rules really matter. So there we have a bit of answers in political science on the dynamics.
Thank you, Charlotte. We have a question that came in for Mesvin. You're being asked how intrinsic values affect students in general. And the person who asked it seems to mean values in terms of resources, personal history, as well as moral, mental, and intellectual values.
I think there's a number of ways you could think about values, and there's some really powerful frameworks that center values and understanding student motivation and outcomes, a range of specific types of values on what matters to you in terms of society and education and achievement. I think an important takeaway in relation to our work is that those types of values that are most predictive of motivation and achievement do not systematically vary by socioeconomic background in the way that would explain the disparities that we see in outcomes. So the lower SCS students are often sort of higher in a lot of these values that are important for achievement-related outcomes, but a number of other barriers reduce the payoff of those values for achievement is the takeaway in relation to our work.
Thank you, Mesvin. We're getting very close to the end. I guess I have a question for the three panelists. So I in my talk talked about, obviously there's a lot that had to do with COVID-19 and also the economic fallout that we've seen from the pandemic. But I'm just curious whether the three of you, I know you're kind of, you're working on your super interesting, research that's going to be relevant for, when we get out of these times. But I'm curious, I know you're probably seeing connections to what's going on right now. So I was just curious to hear from you on that as we close things up. So maybe I'll start backwards this time and talk to Gordon.
Yeah, it's, as you talked about, Karen, we were getting some good news before COVID hit. And that was a combination of some good policy and some good luck. And we faced this absolutely enormous setback. And I guess where I'm most concerned is the way in which COVID has eliminated people's reservoirs of savings. And it has, in effect, destroyed the capital stock of many small businesses. So we're very focused on looking at kind of changes in flows in terms of what COVID has done, which have been incredibly dramatic. Everything about COVID is just big. But there's important impacts on stocks of wealth, of public capital and of private capital that's going to live with us for a long time. And understanding those dimensions and thinking about which policies are going to be operative to address those shortfalls is something where I'm kind of focusing attention.
That's terrific. Thank you. I'd love to talk to you more about that sometime. Mesman.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of COVID, I think one of the things that higher education administrators and policymakers are often thinking about is, how to deal with changes in resources and how to maybe restructure what you're doing to be more effective. And psychology has lots of answers to that. They don't often make it outside of the journals. And I think that's some of the work that I was talking about is different ways that shifts in current practice, whether it's the faculty level or certain resources that are allocated in different types of ways, can have a much bigger bang for their buck if they're targeted towards thinking about the actual demographics of students who could benefit the most, and actually all students benefit when you have that type of targeting.
Thank you. This is on the we shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste point. Charlotte, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm actually slightly obsessed also with I'm starting a new project on that, with mass attitudes towards deficits and large level of debt. Because I think economists just assume because interest rates are pretty low, it's kind of a non-issue. But I found that there's a subset of Republicans who are really concerned about these things, and it's no joke. They're there. And so I think fine with Trump, they put it aside because there were other things on the table, but it makes sense that the Republicans are actually fighting hard on this. And the other mechanism I'm concerned about is what I call the reversal towards self-interest among the bleeding heart liberals. I don't think it's a problem in the US because taxation rates are so low that I think they can tolerate. But in Europe, taxation rates are pretty high, and there's still a lot of deficit. And so I'm concerned that they're going to withdraw their support. And then I'm concerned there might be a backlash that comes out of these concerns about the money going to free riders, moral hazard. So I'm starting a project on these types of attitudes.
Yeah, all super interesting. I will say, I think on the debt deficit, I'm one of those economists with the low interest rates, but I agree with you. It's either going to be an obstacle because people actually view it as such, or just because they basically tell people that they should be concerned about that. So that's all super important. Okay, so we are past time. Sorry, there were tons of good stuff that came up in the chat. I want to remind people that if you click on the 3 dots at the bottom of chat, if you can save the chat on your own computer if you want to save it for posterity. But I want to thank all of our panelists. This really was terrific, and I learned so much. So if we could just give a hand to our panelists, that would be great.